If you have been dabbling with gouache, regular watercolor, or maybe wanting to check out watercolor inks, liquid watercolors, but don't really know when to use those types of mediums, if you can use all three in a painting, or when it's appropriate to use all three versus just one, or what the best qualities are for each, then this video is going to cover it all. So let's dive in. First things first, let's talk about the differences between these three mediums. So the first thing, the biggest difference between these three is the opacity or the transparency. So liquid watercolor or watercolor dye is a transparent medium, just like watercolor, regular watercolor paint is. However, gouache, you can, if you add more water, you can get some transparency in there, but the main quality of this is that it's an opaque version of watercolor. So it's got a more creamy, velvety look to it, and it's really great for layering. So if you're adding on details later on to paintings, like a bright pop of white or opaque green or something that you can layer on top so that you don't see underneath it, that's a great place to use gouache. However, you can still layer with ink watercolor or with regular watercolor paint. It's just gonna have a more transparent quality. And with ink watercolor or liquid watercolor, you can't really build it up to get that really thick, opaque look. It's just always gonna be liquidy and transparent. But with regular watercolor paint, if you just have like a buttery texture or you use it straight out of the tube, you can get it to be really thick where you don't see through it. I have a really great video where I cover a tea to butter exercise with watercolor paint. That's gonna be really eye-opening for you if you don't know what I'm talking about. Buttery texture, creamy texture, you can get that with watercolor paint similar to gouache, but gouache, that's like what it's mainly used for, is that really creamy, velvety, opaque look. So to sum it up with opacity, transparency, and layering, watercolor paint is kind of like the in-between version of gouache over here, where it's really velvety, creamy, and opaque, watercolor paint. And then liquid watercolor or dye-based watercolor is very transparent. You can still layer with it. It's just gonna have a totally different look and effect because it's gonna be mostly see-through. You can get thicker, like darker amounts of the liquid or the dye on it, but it's still gonna be transparent. It's transparent medium. Unless you're adding in like an white India ink, or you're adding gouache into it, then obviously it's becoming a whole new medium. But by itself, it's very, very transparent. It's liquid, and it's got dye like calligraphy ink or, you know, pen or whatever. So that's kind of the main difference there with transparency. Opaque, the most opaque you'll get is with gouache. In between, you can still get really opaque with watercolor paint, but you can also still get really transparent, obviously. And then with liquid watercolor, very transparent, totally different look. Next biggest difference or quality between these three mediums is wet and wet technique. So wet and wet versus wet and dry, I cover this in detail in my watercolor books and in the Complete Beginner's Guide to Watercolor. So make sure you check out those videos if you really are brand new to watercolor or water-based medium like this, where you're having these two different techniques that you're painting with. So check out those videos. But wet and wet is literally how it sounds. Two wet areas of pigment or water on paper with pigment, touching, blending, blooming, exploding. So on the far end, you have gouache, which is still like it's an opaque watercolor. You can still use wet and wet technique. You'll still see some blooming, some blending, but it's not as loose, or it's a little bit more stiff. It's more velvety and creamy texture. So even with watercolor paint, regular watercolor paint, if you have a consistency that's on the end of like cream and butter texture, then it's not gonna blend as well. But if it's on the coffee and tea end of the spectrum, then it's gonna bloom and spread like crazy. And that's the spectrum of liquid watercolor. So liquid watercolor is like nothing else when it comes to spreading and blooming. It just takes over and sprints. So it's really, really fun if you have some wild, vibrant colors that you want to mix and bloom together. If you want to really enjoy the magic of blooming and wet technique, then watercolor ink is your jam. I've been loving it lately because it's just so meditative and calming to watch the colors like explode into one another, or just putting water down and dropping color and watching it explode is really, really fun. So on that end of the spectrum, wet technique is like explosive, and then watercolor paint can get there, but it's not quite as explosive as watercolor ink. And then gouache, You can still use some wet and wet technique, but it's more of like a diffused, soft look. And then the thicker in consistency your watercolor paint and your gouache gets, the less you're going to be able to use wet and wet technique for like the actual explosive, blooming, blending look that you get with that. So where I would use these 3 mediums with wet and wet technique, it really depends on what I'm painting. So if I'm going for a really juicy, vibrant, crazy blooming floral piece or landscape even, I'm gonna go for my watercolor inks. They're just so fun to play with, and it's more about the process than actually what I'm painting when it comes to wet and wet technique. Do I want to watch something explode and just run wild with color and be super vibrant? I'm gonna go for my liquid watercolor. Or do I want something that's more creamy, more pastel, and more of a velvety look? Then I'm gonna grab my gouache. And there's gonna be some moments in between where I want just a clean watercolor where I can kind of dip my toes on either end of the spectrum. And it's fun to use all 3 together. Sometimes I'm painting landscapes or I'm painting a detailed floral piece that's still loose but has more layers to it, and I want to use liquid watercolor, I want to use regular watercolor, and I want to use gouache. So there's a lot of opportunity for you to use all of the best qualities for all of 3 of these mediums because they go well on watercolor paper. They are basically all watercolors, gouache being an opaque watercolor, and they all kind of give you different looks and effects. So obviously gouache being the velvety, creamy, and pastel looks that you can get, watercolor being the like go-to for kind of anything almost, and then liquid watercolor just being explosive, kind of like the crazy child in the family. We love the crazy kid. So then the next biggest quality or difference between these 3 mediums is, now that we've talked about wet and wet, wet and dry. Wet on dry is when you're layering. So you're gonna wait for your base layer to dry and then layer more pigment on top, or you're layering pigment on dry paper. With wet and dry technique, you can use all 3 methods for wet and dry, but they're gonna give you a different look. Gouache, you can go either way on the value scale. So you can layer dark colors on top of lighter colors, or you can layer lighter colors on top of darker colors. You can go either way because it's an opaque version of watercolor. Whereas watercolor, if you're layering lighter colors on top of darker, yes, if you're layering lighter colors on top of darker, because it's still slightly transparent, the lighter color, you can do it. It's just gonna kind of add a glaze to the darker color. It's not gonna stand out and be opaque. So if I'm layering yellow on top of a really deep blue, it's just gonna kind of glaze over that deep blue with the yellow instead of be like a pop of yellow on top of a deep blue. With gouache, you can do that. You can layer your lighter colors, your highlights at the very end. With watercolor, you technically can do lighter colors later, but it's gonna be more of like a glaze look. It's not gonna be a pop look. So if I want to save highlights that are really opaque and poppy and bright, then I'm gonna use my gouache. And I can do that if I'm painting with liquid watercolor or regular watercolor and just add gouache later. But that's the magic of gouache, is the layering. And then obviously you can still layer and use wet and dry technique with both liquid watercolor and regular watercolor paint. You're just gonna have to do it light to dark. Or if you are doing dark to light, you're just gonna be glazing on top of the colors. And along with that, liquid watercolor is even further down the spectrum. It is like a totally different look when you layer it. So it's not as, it doesn't blend in as well. There's another kind of element to this, is that liquid watercolor is dye. It's very staining. And so lifting color isn't as easy. Blending color, once it's like kind of dry, isn't very easy at all. But with watercolor and gouache, you can still kind of re-wet things. You can lift really easily. And so that's another thing to keep in mind, is that liquid watercolor or dye is really, really intense and strong. And so once it's on paper, it's gonna stain the paper. Or once it's mixed up in your palette, let's say you mixed up too much of a color or something and it's in your palette, if it dries, it's dry. It's not being activated again. So with watercolor, you can go straight from the tube and you can dry watercolor and re-wet it and activate it and still use it. Same thing with gouache. But with liquid watercolor or dye-based watercolor, you're not gonna be able to do that. It stays put once it's dry. And then my fifth and final thing that kind of is the biggest difference between these three mediums is color mixing or blending. So a lot of the color mixing and blending kind of just happens as I'm painting with watercolor paint and gouache. I'm pointing to them like they're sitting with me right here, but gouache is over here, watercolor paint is here, dye watercolor. So gouache and regular watercolor, I'm kind of just grabbing paint as I go and mixing it on my brush, in my palette, on paper. But because dye-based watercolor or liquid watercolor is so staining and intense, you kind of want to know what you're doing before you start painting. You can have a little bit of this moment where you're mixing as you're going, but it's best if you have it worked out in your palette or in little plastic jars or something before going to your paper, because sometimes if I'm painting with regular watercolor or gouache, I decide I don't like a color, how it looks on paper as I'm painting, and I'll add another color to it and kind of mix it around until it gets right. Or I'll layer on top of it, because gouache, you can do that and it can change the color completely because it can be totally opaque if it's really creamy and buttery. But with watercolor inks or liquid watercolor, it is really difficult to shift in color. Once it's on paper, you can still do that with certain colors. It depends on the color, but it can be very staining. So you do want to be mindful of that. It's dye. So it's like thinking about dyeing a t-shirt or, tie-dyeing something. Once it's on that t-shirt, it's pretty much on there. Can you wash it out a little bit? Yes. Can you add another color to it? Yes. But that color, that really intense pink or orange or whatever, is still going to be there. So keep that in mind when you're painting with watercolor inks, that you're going to have these colors are going to be really intense on paper, or they're not going to be able to move very nicely as like regular watercolor paint or gouache would. But I love the pigments that you get, the vibrancy and the intensity of color that you get with these watercolor dyes. So again, that's kind of the loveliness and also the difficulty of watercolor ink or watercolor dye. So those are the 5 main differences between those 3 mediums. I have a complete beginner's guide to all 3 of them. So if you want like a deep dive on gouache, a deep dive on regular watercolor paint, and a deep dive on liquid watercolor, make sure you check out those videos. We'll link them in this video and in the description. But then you might be asking yourself, okay, so when do I know which medium to choose for what I'm painting? And it really comes down to 2 things. One, what's the kind of process, or like what do you want to feel when you're painting? Do you want to be like, whoa, that was so explosive and fun and vibrant and intense? Or do you want more of like a creamy, layered look to your painting, or a more graphic look to your painting, because gouache can have that like really blocked color look? Or do you want all 3? Sometimes I am a huge fan, whether it's florals, landscapes, doesn't matter, of using all 3 mediums. So if I want a really like layered part of the painting, then I would use gouache. Or I know that I'm gonna have highlights that are really bright and need to be opaque, then I'm gonna use gouache. Or I want something that blends really nicely and kind of works in both qualities, then I'm gonna use watercolor paint. Or if I want really intense colors and really intense explosive blooming in wet and wet technique, then I'm gonna use watercolor inks. So there's a lot of different approaches that you can get out of all 3, and there's no reason that you can't use all 3 in any type of painting. It doesn't matter what you're painting. You need to think about what kind of process you wanna have. Like, so do you want to watch the blooms go and explode, or do you want it to be more stiff and velvety and creamy, or in between? Or do you want a really layered, more graphic look? So that's gonna be on this end of the spectrum. Or do you want something that's really loose, transparent, and like dye look? So those are your 2 questions that you'll ask yourself when you're approaching a blank sheet of paper and wondering which medium to choose. I don't really ask myself those questions. I'm telling you to ask yourself those questions, and I'm telling you now that I don't actually ask myself those questions. I just sit down and I start painting, and whatever comes to me in the moment, that feeling of, ooh, I want to watch something go poof, like this over here, then I'll choose watercolor inks. Or if I want something that looks more graphic or layered, then I'll choose gouache. So it kind of happens in the flow of the moment for me. And maybe that's because I have a lot of practice with these mediums, or that's just my style. I'm a very type B, loosey-goosey, go with the flow type of person. But those are the questions that you would ask yourself if you're really brand new to these mediums and you don't really know when to use them. What type of process are you looking for? And what's the outcome? So I hope that was helpful for you. Make sure you go check out those 3 complete beginner guides to gouache, watercolor, and watercolor inks to really help you dive deep into those mediums. Let me know in the comments below what your biggest takeaway was, if you've loved enjoying or painting with watercolor inks, or you've never tried it before, and same thing with gouache and all of that. I would love to hear and see what you're loving about these mediums. And as always, thank you so much for watching and engaging with these videos, and I'll see you in the next one.